Let's rank some datasheets for the Heretic Astartes today, with a tier list of Chaos spacemarine units in the 10th edition Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an updated tier list for the new Codex, given that quite a lot of datasheets have changed, there's brand new detachments out and about, and now the points costs have been revealed in full. For this video I thought it would be interesting to talk through the biggest winners and losers from the Chaos Codex currently, take a look at each spiky or mutated unit in turn, and talk about what it brings to the table for its points cost and whether or not they're looking strong or not right now. There's certainly units within the Codex that seem stand out strong, a whole load of stuff that seems broadly usable in the right sort of detachments, and just a few things that really seem to be underpowered for their cost and unlikely to get any sort of major competitive play. As always, tier lists in Warhammer 40k are a bit on the arbitrary side. In any given one, some things could be ranked a little bit higher or lower depending on the army, the context, or personal playstyle. Plus there's plenty of stuff where it's kind of a bit torn between two tiers and could have happily put a unit in either. On top of that, in 10th edition in particular, detachments are an absolutely massive deal as to which units are stronger or weaker. Realistically, every single detachment would have its own tweaked tier list with some more standout units and some things that aren't quite as interesting in that particular one. Though for the most part I'm going to try and keep this for a bit more generic datasheet strength, maybe a few nods to things that work better in some of the stronger detachments, though I do feel like the Chaos Space Marines have access to quite a number of them that are just general purpose ones that work well for a bunch of units. Things like Veterans of the Long War, Renegade Raiders, and Pact Bound Zealots all have quite a lot of broad use for most of the Chaos Codex. Maybe the one that skews things the most is the Soul-Forged War Pack. It means that basically any demon engines in that would be a tier better than I'd rate them here pretty much. They just get a lot of strength and support compared with elsewhere. In any case though, let's jump straight into it. I've tried to rate the Chaos Space Marine units into 5 rough tiers of current strength. I will go through each datasheet in turn and talk about some of its pros and cons for the points cost. Starting out in tier 5, here we have some of the units that I'd consider weakest out of the ones in game currently. I've chosen to put the Spawn, Helldrake and Noctilith Crown here. Previously for 70 points I felt like Chaos Spawn were sort of borderline usable, alright little interference units. They were kind of annoyingly hard to take down with their regeneration and could do a little bit of damage to medium infantry. Maybe not awful as an alternative to cultists for sort of interference units. Games Workshop really hit them quite hard in the Codex though, making them Objective Control 0 makes them so much worse for being trading units as they can't take points anymore, and instead of having their regeneration ability, they have a -1 OC ability for enemies nearby, which isn't terrible, but I feel like it really just pushes them towards just being really not tough or dangerous for their cost and not taking objectives. And there's cheaper things out there that could just do a bit of an interference rule like cultist mobs or other small units. Just seems very unlikely that you'd really want to take a Chaos Spawn in any sort of optimized list when you could get Chaos Legionaries just for 10 points more for 5 of them. Otherwise, for standout bad units, the Helldrake still feels very neglected. 205 points for the Draconic Chaos Flyer, and this one just remains massively overcosted for what it brings to the table. I feel like its datasheet genuinely does have some interest, it does move very fast, it can make charges a long way away, it's got a torrent weapon and some interesting devastating wound attacks that it can do when it melees against fly things, but its defense is pretty bad for the points and its damage is very bad for the points. I feel like realistically it would probably need to go down in cost by something like 50 points or more before it would be particularly competitive. Perhaps unfortunately lowest for the low for Chaos though is the Noctilith Crown, 125 points for a fortification that previously at least had some interest in an invulnerable save aura. In the Chaos Codex though it swapped that out for a +1 leadership aura, and I guess you're going to get a little bit of peripheral benefit from getting cover from things behind it and a short range shooting attack. +1 leadership is normally absolutely spectacularly bad. I suppose for Chaos Space Marines it's a little bit less than it would otherwise be, given that it could mean that you pass a few more dark packs. I guess in the pact bound attachments that could actually have at least a bit of impact, but realistically even if this was affecting several units I think you're still going to be better off just taking out another dangerous unit. You could have another scary gun tank like a Predator tank for the same sort of cost, and I feel like you're going to get more value out of something like that as opposed to making other units fail their dark packs a little bit less, as it's not even like it even prevents you from failing dark packs. The only time it would make a difference is if you literally roll a 5, at least for the standard Chaos Space Marine units. Moving upwards to tier 4, here are a few more units I consider kind of overshadowed, and I seem to have wound up putting a lot of characters here though it wasn't by design. I feel like maybe characters, even if they're sort of bad compared with other ones, might still sometimes have a bit more niche use with certain enhancements or combos, I guess. First up, the Master of Possession really didn't come through the Codex change well at all. He's 70 points, and it allows you to get enhancements into possessed squads, which I feel like is probably his biggest selling point now. Otherwise, though, he gives you +1 to advance and charge, which isn't terrible, but it's not much to write home about, and a sniping shooting attack that can at least be a fair enough threat to some characters in the midst of units, though I feel like you have to be rolling quite hot if you want to kill anything higher than a 3 wound character. Losing the 6+ feel no pain that he used to give was really quite a big blow to him, as that was pretty much the single most reliable boost that he gave. It was quite nice to make Possess just a bit more tanky against things that are flat damage 3. The Cultist Firebrand for 45 points. I think Games Workshop didn't do the best job of making him particularly worth it for Cultist leadership. He brings a big heavy flamer to the unit, allows the units to re-roll leadership tests, which can be alright for Dark Packs I guess, and is a lot cheaper than the Dark Commune. Plus hands out a bit of battle shock to enemies with the flamer, though most of the time it isn't really that relevant when you're handing out a battle shock test within your own turn. Unfortunately, it just doesn't really seem like there's that good a niche for this. The Dark Commune gives you the same re-roll leadership thing, and for just 20 points it gives you so much more beyond that, between invulnerable saves and giving you advance and charge type things and a big boost of melee. It means that the Dark Commune is almost certainly worth the upgrade if you're buffing some cultists worth leading like the Accursed Cultists, and if you just take your small squad of regular 10-men cultists with auto pistols and things to use sticky objectives and things, then they usually tend to be the last unit that you want to invest more points in a character leading them, as the cheaper the better for their role, and if you really wanted them to act more efficiently you might as well just buy another unit of them rather than add in a fancy flamer man. I guess if you wanted just something ridiculously cheap for the leadership reroll and maybe to bear an enhancement, then he could fit the bill. Realistically, just seems directly outcompeted by the Dark Commune though, which is kind of a shame. Next up, for 60 points, we've got the regular Chaos Sorcerer. His datasheet I did think maybe could have used a tweak to its second special rule, which isn't really very impactful. He gives you -1 to hit for his unit, which is alright, but not standout. A bit of extra shooting with his smite attack, and then he has a chance to cause some mortal wounds with his psychic attacks as well. But that's dependent on the enemy failing a leadership test, so it's not going to come up that often. Overall, basically 60 points for a sort of okay shooting attack and a mediocre durability buff just isn't enough for 60 points. If a squad's worth leading with a character, it's likely going to be worth leading with one of the other ones that's a bit more dangerous, particularly the things that can fight hard in melee and give you some sort of combat damage boost. Next up, for 65 points, we've got the Traitor Enforcer. Again, feels like he's in a similar sort of position to the Cultist Firebrand, maybe not absolutely terrible for a character based on stats alone. Combined, that Renegade Commissar plus his Ogren Bodyguard get 8 attacks at either strength 6 or 7 with damage 2, which isn't awful damage output for a character. Plus he can give his unit free Overwatch, so maybe a little bit more chip damage from the Traitor Guardsman I guess. Really though, the overall package just isn't really exactly what you want for a Traitor Guardsman squad unfortunately. They're not a melee squad, so don't really want to wind up in combat and put the Commissar and Ogren stats to the test. Again, usually if you're taking them, it makes sense for cheaper units to hold down objectives for small amounts of investment with OC2 and a bit of cover. And in general, it doesn't really make sense to spend points on characters to buff them versus other more dangerous units out there. In general, I feel like if you want to sink investment into the damned units, then it's probably the Accursed Cultists. Next up for 190 points is the Lord Discordant. It was a shame that he didn't get some sort of improvement in the Codex, either on his datasheets or on his points cost. He's just all round expensive for his damage and defense. His vehicle debuff things are really matchup dependent, so in some games he's going to not use his special rules very much. It really was a shame that he didn't get access to the Soulforged Warpack type benefits, as he is a mounted unit, not a vehicle keyword unit, and that just feels like a massive oversight really. I feel like they should have let him use those advantages or given him the vehicle keyword, one or the other. And if you just want a big fighty generic character, then the Demon Princes are likely to be the better bet for their investment and what they get in return. So for things that directly boost damage and defense, you probably want to go for them. As a result, I just can't really see him being used in any kind of optimized list. Moving onwards to tier 3, here are a whole load of units that I consider kind of usable but maybe not optimal. At least all with something to sell them though, and you might want to include them in some sort of niche list, either being very good in one particular detachment, or just having some interesting abilities that maybe aren't standouts but could fit the role for an exact unit purpose if you wanted one. First up for 85 points we've got the Raptors. They move fast as the Chaos Space Marine jump infantry, have some sort of middling damage output threat with a single power fist and a special weapon and a bunch of chainswords, and then beyond that do some leadership and battle shock things, perhaps hopefully spooking the enemy off objectives. Could be okay for cheap deep striker to do secondary objectives and things, and dread talons can give some further benefits. I feel like just for cheap deep strikers to do secondaries you might be more tempted by allied nurglings currently, or for fast moving units that skirmish things the Chaos Bikers feel a bit better right now. I would say that these guys aren't unusable. Next up, we've got the Accursed Cultists, which has weighing up between Tier 3 and Tier 2. They did take a big nerf in the Codex, in that they can no longer regenerate models to the squad, which is a big blow, but following that they did drop down to 85 points, down from 105, which does mean that you can get quite a lot of fairly threatening chaff on the board. For a big investment blob, you can get 6 Torments, 10 Mutants, and then the Dark Commune all put together. 21 models for 235 points, all with a 5+ invulnerable save and a 6+ feel no pain, fairly threatening in melee, and then they get that big surge move to jump them towards the enemy when they get shot. And it could make a big blob like that irritating to deal with at range on midfield objectives, as you might kill a couple of them, then they just jump into combat with you, so they can't be shot anymore. Otherwise, they have the option to scout up the board if no characters are attached, which isn't awful for the cost at 85 points, I guess. And they are a pretty focal unit for Chaos Cult, where most of the options work best on them versus anything else, though as a detachment it's kind of weak. I don't think Accursed Cultists are quite strong enough to turn that around for them. Still though, I think it's kind of interesting with their surge move type thing. I'd probably put them lower tier 2 or upper tier 3. Next up, for Servants of Slanesh and their index, we have the Noise Marines, 85 points, or at least a fairly threatening shooting unit, maximally equipping for range. I guess you'd have 3 Sonic Blasters, a Doom Siren, and a Blastmaster within the unit. A lot of shots to clear out hordes fairly well, plus some punchy damage 3 on the Blastmaster. I feel like they're not awful for a ranged option, but they lose out on some big rerolls, objective control, and an extra heavy melee weapon versus the Legionaries. I wouldn't rate them quite as strong as those, who also get a bit more support as well. Maybe could be a nice choice in something like Renegade Raiders perhaps, with the assault keyword and extra AP on objectives. Again, I'd probably put them towards the upper end of this tier. Could be good in some of the more shooting focused detachments. For 170 points, we've got the Obliterators. Again, these guys took a few nerfs in the Codex unfortunately. They're not able to be fielded in squads of 4 anymore, and the melter weapon range got reduced a bit, so they can't basically step out of deep strike and instantly melter something, which does limit their threat a little bit against big heavy tanks and vehicles. They did go down in points a bit for their trouble though, and overall I still say that they're not awful general purpose flexible firepower. Again, can be okay in some of the shooting detachments, maybe dropping in to try and destroy something that's battle shocked in Dread Talons could be kind of fun, with the big reroll stratagem that they can get there. For 70 points, we've got the Traitor Guardsmen. These guys pay a 20-point premium over the Chaos Cultists for better armor saves, free cover on objectives, better OC, and a few threatening special weapons in the unit, an option that the standard Chaos Cultists lack now. These guys, however, don't get the sticky objective, and an extra 20 points for what hopefully should be kind of minimal investment chaff, I think makes them a bit second tier to cultists for most people. I guess maybe if you did have 20 points spare or so, then they might not be the worst upgrade in the world, but that sticky objectives rule is kind of a shame to pass up on, even if they do get better armor and more threat with special weapons. For 85 points, we've got the Felgor Beastmen, 10 toughness 4, 5+ save grunts with fairly low damage for their points cost. I feel like their drop in the Codex really wasn't enough. The main reason to take them would be to have one of them arriving from reserves turn 1. So you could put a whole bunch of bodies in the midfield, though I don't think I'd really take more than 1 unit at that, and potentially not even 1. Could be handy enough to threaten secondary objectives or charges on midfield objectives dead early, though I still think it's hard to get over their fairly bad damage and defense for the points cost. I'd probably be a bit borderline between tier 3 and tier 4 here. Next up, we've got the Predator Annihilator for 130 points. This one does fairly straightforward, dedicated anti-armor firepower. 3 big las cannon shots, and you get to re-roll the damage results of 1. Getting some sustained hits from Dark Pats can be nice with that. I'd say that the points just let this down a little bit versus things like the Predator Destructor, Vindicator, and Forge Fiend. I feel like all 3 of those are probably better at stacking big damage on heavily armoured enemies. The Destructor isn't quite as efficient against really tough stuff, but I think it makes up for it with a lot more flexibility, as it's far more threat against 3 wound infantry or hordes and things if you happen to be fighting those. For 130 points, there's the Hellbrute. This one has sort of mediocre damage and defense, a bunch of 2+ save wounds, a melee weapon, and a heavy weapon. I say it's usually worth taking the melee weapon for a bit of countercharge threat, but it's really quite slow to get to combat to bring it to bear. The main reason to take a Hellbrute is the aura of boosted Dart Packs. You get both effects on nearby units, which is rather nice, and it makes it particularly good in the Pack-Bound Zealots detachment, where you can potentially have both of those effects going off on a 5+, sustained and lethal hits on a 5 is really quite big for any nearby gun tank. I say probably tier 2 in Pack-Bound Zealots, but otherwise I feel like the aura maybe isn't quite standout enough to make up for its overall lack of stats. Next up, there's the Defiler at 190 points. This one's a general purpose demon engine with a variety of guns, including a big battle cannon and some other threatening stuff, and it does hit pretty hard in melee as well with those enormous strength 16 claws. Typically, it was a slightly rare pick compared with some of the other demon engines out there, given that it lacks a little bit of focus, plus the big profile can be kind of awkward to get around terrain, even with that crawler rule that allows it to go over things that are less than 4 inches high. It did gain that counter-offensive thing in the Codex, which I think is handy, though realistically, unless you're threatening it with 2 CP otherwise, it just means that your opponent's likely to be attacking it first with whatever they charged it with. It is definitely a helpful thing to have though, and could make things awkward, say if they want to multi-charge it. Like the rest of the demon engines, it's far better in Soulforged Warpack. The +1 to wound is quite nice for that broad battery of different weapons it gets, and +2 attacks in close combat's really quite a big deal with those threatening claws. Next up, we've got Harkon Worldclaimer for 90 points. He's the Black Legion Raptor Lord and hits home with a bunch of power weapon attacks, a spear attack at range and melee, a few more leadership shenanigans, and some big mortal wound impact hits for his unit. If you can get a whole bunch of Raptors into engagement range on the charge, you could hit home pretty hard. I think he's usable enough if you did want to build around Raptors as a damage dealer type squad, though most people generally tend to go for something different. I'd say he seems merely okay for what you get, rather than enormously standout. He does have a pretty fun model though, I think. Here on Blackheart of the Red Corsairs is 80 points. Perhaps his biggest single selling point is redeploying infantry units after both sides have set up. It's particularly good with the Deceptors detachment where you get a bunch of infiltrate type units, so you could see after both sides have fully deployed if you want to move around any of those units to either make them a little bit more safe or put them a bit more threatening if they can afford to be. So fairly solid there for a bit of first turn, really proper board control. Otherwise, he's a fighty Chaos Lord beyond that, with another bunch of power weapon attacks from that claw or axe. He gives his unit a little bit more OC, so they're going to be fairly tough on objectives until they're taken down. And his familiar gives a once per game reactive move, which is handy enough when you're skirmishing for midfield objectives, and maybe the enemy might be trying to charge you. Again, maybe it feels like a sort of optional utility sort of unit, as opposed to one that's always going to be the front and centre of everyone's choices. I think he's got some fairly stiff competition from the standard Chaos Lord. Next up for 165 points is the Demon Prince on foot. He's a character with at least some fairly chunky stats, reasonable enough toughness, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and fairly nicely general purpose melee attacks with a bunch of mid-strength damage 3 hits. His actual core attacks hit a little bit harder than the winged version with some inbuilt rerolls, though he lacks the big mortal wound impact hit, and his bonus rule is to get an aura of cover for things nearby, though it does only affect infantry. Could be interesting enough for any slightly tanky infantry units trying to take the midfield, maybe things like Chaos Warriors in the Fellhammer detachment. Demon Princes can be quite nice for any big damage or defense enhancements that work out well for them. Perhaps going with the Slanesh mark for the +2-inch movement, and then that elixir enhancement for a 5+ feel no pain. That can make him from being a sort of middling durability to a genuinely quite tough unit. As they go though, I think they're kind of costly for their base stats. Likely not a unit you'd normally want to run multiple of. Next up, for 80 points, we've got the Master of Executions. His Great Axe hits home with 5 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, all with devastating wounds and precision, so fairly good at taking the heads of enemy champions. He gets a full reroll to hit for his squad in close combat against any damaged enemy units, which are quite nice. Does mean that you could potentially coordinate a big charge with him and his squad against a squad that's already had a bit of chip damage done to it, maybe by a little bit of Chaos firepower. In general though, I would probably still rate him as inferior to the Chaos Lord with their enormous turn of big hitting damage 3 and the free stratagems throughout the game. I would say that he's probably on the upper end of tier 3 if he's here though, maybe higher tier 3 or lower tier 2, I think he's usable enough. Next up we've got the Spider Clone Lord himself, Amphibious Bile. he is 85 points, and augments some Chaos Space Marines or Chosen that he joins with his surgical talents, and he's also allowed to lead Accursed Cultists as well these days. He gives them all +1 strength and toughness, which is quite a nice all-round boost. Besides that, he has some fun anti-infantry attacks, and is surprisingly tough personally, with his feel no pain and chance to get up when he dies. Still potentially might struggle a little bit versus the standard Chaos Lords though, with their big damage strikes and free stratagems, but again I'd say he's usable enough. Next up, Lucius the Eternal's 95 points. To run him now, you need to run the Index Emperor's Children and have him as your warlord, which does come with some restrictions, blocking out some choices and meaning that you have to take Slanesh things. For his units, he brings fights first with a bunch of precision power weapon attacks. He's quite punchy and capable of destroying some of his peers in a 1-to-1 fight, and then he gets his Armor of Shrieking Souls to punish enemies when they destroy him, potentially handing out a little bit of mortal wound damage, maybe getting him to revive from death if he's very lucky. Fights first is perhaps the biggest reason to run him. Again, I'd say it's not awful for the cost, though you do have to put up with the Emperor's Children restrictions to unlock him. You'll probably have a bit more interest when they get their full codex. Next up, with a preacher to convert the masses, we have the Dark Apostle. His primary buff is a +1 to wound in melee. Very nice for close combat things, trying to punch up against tougher targets. Quite nice for Chosen and Legionaries. He also gets a couple of Dark Disciples, which are handy enough to tank some big damage shots. Quite nice when you can tank things like las cannon shots on them, rather than having them fry another Chaos Space Marine. And if it makes sense, you can sacrifice them to get an extra mortal wound on the enemy early in the fight phase. Otherwise, he helps out leadership as well and gets once per game cancel battle shock. Seems handy enough as an overall offering to help boost melee units. The extra models might be a little bit unhelpful for jumping out of rhinos and things though, as they often tend to be. It is a bit restrictive that you can't have 10 models and a Dark Apostle all in the same rhino due to the Dark Disciples. Next up, for 65 points, we have the Twisted Cultist Command Squad in the Dark Commune. As mentioned already, I feel like these guys are the ones that you'd want to go for if you want a character choice to lead some Accursed Cultists. They just give them a whole load of all-round benefits, re-rolling their Dark Pacts, advance and charge on the same turn where they get boosted damage, and a 5+ invulnerable save, which is quite a big deal when you don't have a massive save to start with. They also chip in a little bit of damage and contribute another 5 bodies to the unit, which not all characters do. Not the worst if you're trying to build up an even beefier horde. They're definitely a central unit as well if you wanted to play Chaos Cult, even if that one isn't considered one of the strongest Chaos detachments. Finally, for the units I've chosen to rank in Tier 3, there's the Chaos Lord with the Jump Pack. He brings free stratagems to a unit of Raptors, and likely a fair bit of nasty Strength 8 damage to melee damage. He also allows them to get a 6-inch Consolidate move as well, which can be handy for destroying one thing and then tagging the next. In general, as with Harken Worldclaimer though, the main downside is having to build around Raptors as a sort of primary damage dealer type unit, which you might not necessarily want to do. As with Raptors, he might be a bit more tempting in Dread Talons as well, where you can have him jumping on and off the board with an enhancement, could get some fun mobility jumping from place to place. Kind of a shame he can't lead Warp Talons really though. Moving up to Tier 2, and here's a whole load of units that I'd consider to be really quite strong Chaos units right now. I feel like quite a lot of the mainline damage dealers of the Codex are in the place where they're really quite usable, but maybe not absolutely standout. Different ones maybe being a bit more tempting or less tempting depending on the exact detachment that you're running. Starting out, we've got the Chaos Terminator Squad, 185 points for just some general purpose heretical elite damage dealers. They've got fairly good damage with their reroll hits and dark packs, fairly good durability with their big wounds and big saves. They can escort Abaddon the Despoiler if they want to. It can often just be an interesting unit for giving any sort of central stratagem or enhancement buffs to, as you affect a lot of very dangerous Chaos Space Marines with any of them. They can be quite nice as a rapid ingress threat as well, and maybe feel like a particularly central unit for the Fellhammer Siege host, with their -1 to wound thing being good for them, and being quite a good target for the Bastion plate and the 5+ feel no pain. Could be pretty nice in Veterans of the Long War as well, as they've got a fairly reasonable chance to max the devastating wounds for the Combi Bolter stratagem if you fire a lot of them at once. Perhaps could be one of the better options to use that stratagem on. Next up, we've got the Chosen for 125 points per 5 of them. They had their points revised very slightly down. I still think remain a particularly dangerous melee unit with a Chaos Lord attached. They can advance and charge, hit home with a whole bunch of accursed weapons, also getting a Power Fist and some Lightning Claws hidden within the unit, plus a few fun combi weapons. They could be pretty strong in Renegade Raiders, jumping out of rhinos and hitting things on objectives, and quite like being undivided in pack bound with some full wound rerolls on the go for a 1 CP boost. They can be pretty scary with a Chaos Lord attached. For the same cost as general purpose elite damage dealers, we've got the Chaos Possessed. They move fast, are fairly tough and fairly dangerous. They're not quite as much a threat to literally everything as they used to be, given that they only get devastating wounds on one turn now, as opposed to every time they make a Dark Pact. I did think that was quite a nerf to them, even if they did get a fair bit cheaper than they used to be. They can still be quite nasty to enemy infantry, but might struggle against hard targets with toughness 10 or more or higher saves. For that reason, I'd probably rank them a bit lower tier 2 or upper tier 3. It didn't really help that the Master of Possession got his best buff taken away in that 6+ Feel No Pain as well. Next up, for the Heavy Weapon Chaos Marines, we've got the Havocs. 5 of them are 120 points, and they can certainly hit pretty hard with a whole bunch of las cannon shots, or lots of other choices on offer, depending on what exact firepower that you need. For infantry with heavy weapons, they do have some good advantages. They get to move and fire with pretty good effect, and ignore modifiers to hit. More so than the tanks and things though, they can be really quite fragile to certain firepower, like say heavy bolters, or anything else damaged too. And more so than the tanks, they'll feel every casualty really quite painfully. Every model lost will remove a pretty potent model from the squad. Still scary enough though, and particularly if the opponent doesn't have long range things to reach out and destroy them. Next up, for 50 points, we've got the Cultist mob. These guys are cheap grunts with sticky objectives and don't bring a whole lot to the table. It was a shame that they lost their special weapon access in the Chaos Codex, as it was quite nice to be able just to chip in with a few fairly powerful shots from long range. I still think that despite that though, they're a very useful unit. 50 points for sticky objectives and just an expendable unit to do secondaries and things is reasonable enough. I say they're still worth keeping around to the point where they're probably borderline tier 1 versus tier 2, just literally for utility, being a cheap squad, and having at least one copy to mark your home objective with sticky objectives, maybe before they move on to try and throw themselves towards the midfield. Next up for 240 points is the Chaos Land Raider. This is the premium transport for delivering melee specialists into battle. If you do take one along, then you can average a charge at around about 20-inch range. And it does just provide a really big and scary tank with a lot of tough wounds, some scary las cannon shots with dark pacts, and that big 2+ save will quite like any of the detachments that have an Armour of Contempt equivalent like the Veterans one or the Renegade Raiders. Renegade Raiders are also quite nice for the big damage boost stratagem that they can have when jumping out of transports, which is nice. It could be reasonable enough for delivering things like Chosen, perhaps Terminators, or Possessed into combat, though I feel like it feels a little bit less essential than maybe for Loyalist Space Marines. Chosen can still have quite a big threat range just jumping out of a Rhino thanks to their advance and charge, and it means that a Land Raider is maybe a bit less essential for them. It could be kind of fun in the Soulforged pack as well if you did want a big scary thing transporting some units. Could be an interesting one to use the Possession stratagem on. Next up, for 130 points, we have the Predator Destructor. I feel like I rate this one a little bit higher than the Annihilator just due to being better in terms of being general purpose. A 6-shot autocannon with strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3 is quite nice, particularly when it gets extra AP against things that aren't monsters or vehicles. And then people usually pair it with some las cannons on the sponsons to be a good threat against armor. For 130 points, I think it's absolutely fine as a cheapish gun turret to have sat around in the backfield for a few turns, maybe push up the board when necessary. Anything that just gives it a bit of extra damage will do well, whether it's rerolls in veterans, extra AP versus objectives for potentially AP3 autocannons, or dark pack buffs like the Mark of Nurgle in the pack-bound detachment. Next up, we've got some demon engines, all of which are looking really quite strong and scary at the moment. The Forge Fiend's 190 points, so you're definitely paying a bit of a premium for that, but it is just very general purpose and a threat to most things out there. 3 ectoplasma cannons means that you've got blast keywords to be able to stack massive amounts of hits on hordes, and still easily enough strength and damage to threaten vehicles and elites. It can also get devastating wounds as well at the cost of some hazardous rolls. At range, having access to a +1 to wound from the Soulforged hunting pack can be pretty nasty against enemy heavies. It can get some more support there, like the reroll Aura 1-2. And like the rest of the demon engines, it's going to be kind of top tier here. Certainly still nice enough with Mark of Nurgle or the Undivided one in Pac-Man Zealots as well. Even if it's not the most common, the autocannon version might still be a bit more interesting in the Renegades detachment with that extra AP on offer too. Next up, for 130 points, there's the Mauler Fiend. This one got a very nice points cut in the Codex points, mainly to compensate it for losing rerolls to advance and charge, but it does mean that you get all of its damage and defense for 10 points less, and I feel like it's come away looking really quite good. I think it's got enough defense to justify itself on the front line with its big wound count and its invulnerable save, but also scary melee threat that the opponent can't really ignore. 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 2, and damage d6 plus 1, plus either a bunch of lasher tendrils or some melter weapons. If it needs to make an extra big splash into close combat, then it can use tank shock really well. Again, it'll really love the Soulforged pack. A plus 2 attacks in close combat is kind of massive, and has a stratagem to be able to move through walls to get charges easier. Again, certainly top tier here. It might like Slanesh in the pack bound attachment as well, with the boosted sustained hits and access to advance and charge. For 110 points, the Venom Crawler's also looking really nice as well. This one's maybe not quite as general purpose as the Mauler Fiend or the Forge Fiend, but just really quite strong against anything that's Space Marine size or weaker. 12 shots at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 is pretty good focused firepower to make a mess of enemy infantry, and it gets a few more of those attacks in melee. As with the rest of them, it can get way more threatening in the Soulforged pack for the big plus 1 to wound when shooting. That could make it a genuinely scary threat to consider against anything that it would normally be wounding on a 5+. I might like Renegade Raiders for being able to advance and shoot, so move 12 inches plus an advance move, still fire at full accuracy, and then get some extra AP against units on objectives. Strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 is just a lot more general purpose than AP 1. It is still a bit fragile for its cost though at toughness 9, and its gaining attacks rule got nerfed as you no longer get that at range anymore, but I still think it's very strong for 110 points. Next up, for 175 points, there's the Chaos Vindicator. This one's a pretty fearsome anti-tank gun turret. D6 plus 1 strength 14 shots with damage D6. The ability to fire when it's locked up in melee, including targeting things it's in combat with, and generally being quite tough at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and plenty of wounds. It is just a fairly scary tank to be reckoned with. Again, as with the Predator and other gun tanks and things, there's all sorts of things that can amp up its damage a little bit. It'll quite like the Renegades for being able to advance and shoot and get line of sight and range and things. An extra AP doesn't hurt. It'll get on well with the Veterans of the Long War rerolls. It'll like Mark of Nurgle in pack bound, and it could be another good possession target in the Soulforged one. It'll also particularly enjoy anything that has an Armour of Contempt equivalent as well. Again, Veterans and the Renegades will have that. I feel like Vindicators are kind of hard to go too far wrong with, particularly with quite a lot of good synergy with several detachments. Again, I'd probably rate them towards the higher end of this tier, maybe borderline tier 1. Next up, it's kind of cool to see a faction super heavy that's genuinely looking like a massive threat. The Khorne Lord of Skulls is 450 points, has some really scary general purpose damage dealing guns with a bunch of damage 3 attacks, never mind anything it gets up to in melee with that ridiculous Great Cleaver of Khorne. This one again is particularly happy in the Soulforged pack. A plus 1 to wound is a big deal at range. Having a main cannon wound a load of tanks on 2s is really scary, and like the Mauler Fiend can make some good use of that stratagem to warp it through walls and things to help it get around the table a bit better. It could be alright for anything else that amps up damage and durability as well. Say for example the 5+ Feel No Pain and Fellhammer seems like you could have a particularly tanky one of these if you wanted, even if it's not usually going to care too much about the -1 to wound thing. It is one great big massive model though that could have trouble against certain matchups or certain boards. If it keeps on getting move blocks or isn't able to pass through certain bits of terrain, then you might have trouble. I feel like it's a pretty good deal for the damage and defense that you get for the cost though, particularly with some of the fun boosts that you can give it. Next up, we've got one of the workhorses of the Chaos Army in the Rhino tank. As with most of the other factions in the game, it's just a cheap and effective transport. Enough wounds for the points that it's really quite annoying to kill, quite fast, and then it helps units get into combat quite a bit, potentially moving up the board turn 1 and then dropping out for a charge turn 2. It's often been used in the past with Chosen and Chaos Lords jumping out of it. They can have a very scary threat range with the disembark plus the advance and charge, and they can be going a really long way into combat. Now Legionnaires at 80 points though, I feel like that's pretty much an equally viable option. They can't go quite as far, but do have their advantages with rerolls, objective control, and just being generally cheap. Nurgle ones in Pact Bound are quite nice, as they're able to use that stratagem to hide from enemy shooting at longer range, which can be quite nice if you just need to make sure it survives a turn in the open before it delivers its cargo. They're also going to be really nice in Renegade Raiders as well, with the reroll stratagem that they can use, rerolling all hits and wounds after disembarking. Out of the units here, I'd rate the Rhino as higher on this tier compared with some. It's just really useful for Chaos Space Marines and has good units to transport, maybe borderline tier 1 just for its utility, and I think a whole load of lists will use it, as they just do have the right units to pair with it. Finally for tier 2, let's get on to some characters. First up we've got Abaddon the Despoiler at 295 points, a big central model for the Chaos Army with his massive reroll aura and really big melee damage stats. He also farms command points as well, though a little bit less reliably than he did before pre-Codex. Almost 300 points for a single character model though is a massive investment, even if he does bring some pretty game-changing boosts. And it perhaps is a bit annoying that the Terminators that you might want to bring with him as a bodyguard don't really want his reroll aura as much, seeing as they get that innately if they make a Dark Pact. I guess it could be interesting enough with Chosen now that he's leading them. I've seen a few people just run him completely solo and just keep him hidden behind terrain, though I guess that might be a little bit less viable than it was before, given that he's lost the Mark of Nurgle. And even if he had it, not every detachment has the Mark to shield him. Still seems good though, you just need to make sure that you build around him if you are including him in an army list. Getting 4 rerolls on a few scary chaos shooting things combined with Dark Pacts can be kind of massive, never mind when he actually gets to make melee and break something with Dracnian. Next up, to lead the Terminators, we've got the Terminator Lord and Sorcerer. The Lord's 95 points and just adds some melee might and some free stratagems to the unit. I feel like he's usable enough, though maybe not crazily stand out for them. I think he will get on with things like Renegade Raiders and the Veterans of the Long War with the free Armour of Contempt's battle tactic stratagems, that would be really quite nice on 2+ save units. He is also dependent on you wanting to build around Terminators as your damage dealer unit to start with, which not every army will want to. I think he's solid enough for what he offers in the right detachment, though maybe a little bit lower on this tier overall. Otherwise, to pair with him, we've got the Sorcerer in Terminator armor. His datasheet debuff is a really nice one. You get to curse one enemy unit within 12 inches for an extra -1 AP against them, and also grants a bit of psychic shooting and re-rolling advance and charge rolls for Terminators, which definitely is handy enough out of Deep Strike Reserve. The AP debuff is a particularly good one, as it means that you could just focus down an enemy unit that was relying on its high saves to keep it safe. Could be very scary in Renegade Raiders when you're stacking the AP with the objective thing. Perhaps his biggest issue for him is that if you want the debuff, then unless you're doing some sort of crazy thing running him solo, you'd have to commit to quite a big unit of Terminators, which is quite a big mainline threat in its own right once you've added this guy. I still think a unit like this is pretty usable overall though, a better chance than normal of making charges out of Deep Strike, and could still rapid ingress and things if they wanted to. Next up, for 70 points, we've got the Warpsmith. Rarely a particularly bad idea if you've got a whole load of vehicles in the army. His main buff is to heal a vehicle and give the same vehicle +1 to hit. Between the two, that's probably going to be adding enough value to justify his existence over the course of several turns of giving and taking damage. And it can be nice to bear fun enhancements for the Soul Forged War Pack, where he's probably going to have his best home. Beyond that, he's got okay personal threats when the enemy gets close as well, with a few interesting pistol attacks plus some melee. And his pseudo lone operative rule can mean that he's kind of handy to have around on objectives as well from time to time. Generally useful to have miniatures that the opponent can't shoot with ranged weapons at long range. Next up, for 180 points, there's the Wings Demon Prince. Out of the two, I feel like he's probably the more devastating out of them. Moving quickly up the board with Fly, getting Deep Strike, and perhaps most scarily of all, getting a single dice per wound that he has remaining whenever he makes a charge. For each 4+ that you roll, he deals a mortal wound, so it means that if you can manage to slam him into an enemy unit after he's not taken any damage, then they'll deal on average 5 mortal wounds to them. It means that he could potentially be quite a nice rapid ingress threat. Otherwise, just being a big scary demon prince is quite good for several enhancements. The 5+ feel no pain from Pact Bound is quite nice, and there's a few other personal damage or defense buffs in some of the other detachments. Again, probably going to have diminishing returns after you've taken one of them with some sort of fun enhancement, and might be a little bit less tempting if you've got something else that you might be tempted to rapid ingress already. I think it's usable enough though. I'll probably rate it towards the lower end of this tier or upper tier 3. Next up, we have the Archivane himself. Vastor is finally for the first time since his model came out looking kind of good in game. 190 points for an extra tanky demon prince with 14 wounds and a 2+ save is a good start. Now Games Workshop have tweaked his melee profile that is actually fairly threatening. A good bunch of attacks with strength 14, AP 2 and damage 3 with devastating wounds and anti-vehicle. That should mean that he can be relied on for at least a little bit of scary enough damage dealing, and he also comes with a sweep mode and a flame attack. It's going to be useful for the demon engines in the Soulforged pack, giving you a +1 strength boost to any of them nearby, and he does have a potentially really quite disruptive special rule against enemy shooting, giving any guns hazardous if they try and shoot him within 18 inches, and that does mean that against the right army there's going to be a lot of guns that just aren't really worth shooting into him, and maybe giving opponents difficult choices about positioning with where they put their things to try and delete him. So I'm maybe a little bit apprehensive that his raw damage dealing isn't quite enough to be enormously exciting for people at almost 200 points, but he's certainly massively better than he was before. I'd probably rate towards the lower end of this tier as well, but it's quite nice to see him looking really quite usable. Finally for tier 2, we have the Fallen Angel Cypher himself, 90 points for a lone operative, and previously he was doing stratagem debuff type things, having one of those ruin a stratagem type rules. I feel like that did get downgraded. He now messes with stratagems against enemy units that he's close to, which is handy but a bit more randomly so. What he did get in return though is actually anti-infantry damage dealing that looks genuinely very scary, and particularly so for a lone operative. He gets 6 bolt pistol shots at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, 3 plasma pistol shots, and all of those getting sustained hits, which is rather nice, and then he basically can get the same again if he charges into melee, going in all guns blazing, having a pretty reasonable chance to wipe out a full squad of 5 Space Marines or quite a big Horde type units between shooting and charging, which is kind of mad for a lone operative. He also comes with that pretty fun shoots back type special rule, where if you shoot him up close, then he'll fire right back at you. I feel like with that much threat to lighter units, plus lone operatives just being generally handy to have, I'm sure some people will be tempted enough to bring him along. Finally though, moving on to tier 1, here are just a few units that I feel like maybe rank above most of the rest, at least for raw datasheet strength. As mentioned, there's a fair few that I felt were a bit borderline between tier 2 and tier 1, and as ever in 40k, detachments change things quite a bit. In the Soulforged War Pack, this will be full of demon engines as well. Having said all that though, I think there's no doubt that Warp Talons, with the rules as they're written in the Codex, are absolutely brutal looking. At 110 points pre-Codex, they were already fairly strong. Fast-moving jump infantry that's likely to get the charge rather than the other way round, and then stack a whole load of strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 attacks on their targets, re-rolling the wound roll with lightning claws, and quite likely going for a sustained hits dark packs, where people liked to run them as Slanesh in the pack-bound detachment. Lots of the detachments have other different ways to get extra damage or movement for them. The big thing that they gained in the Codex though was that big return to reserves rule. Basically, if they have been eligible to fight in the fight phase and then they're no longer within engagement range at the end of that fight phase, usually because they've wiped out their targets, they can then claw their way back into the warp and return to reserves. So basically having a really quite big, scary and hard-hitting unit of fast-moving damage dealers just disappear off into the ether, all ready to come back next turn. Then in theory land at least, after the opponent's done all their movement, these guys would want to rapid ingress during the opponent's turn, drop down somewhere where they can get an easy enough charge in your turn, but also hidden behind terrain, so they're not just going to get shot down by the enemy during their turn, and then proceeds to rinse and repeat, jumping out with maybe 10 Warp Talons, absolutely butcher an enemy infantry unit or similar, and then hightail it off into the warp once more. There are definitely ways to interact with them, like Overwatch or indirect fire, and they won't be able to handle every single unit in the enemy army. They will need to pick things that they can actually destroy in a round of combat, but that still encompasses really quite a lot of things when you've got 10 Warp Talons with a pretty ludicrous amount of good AP attacks with reroll wound rolls, and should be able to handle most infantry units really quite comfortably. And you could always chip in a little bit of shooting beforehand to make sure that the outcome isn't in too much doubt. Even at worst, they still amount to just a generally scary and fast, if slightly fragile melee unit, even if they don't do their shenanigans. So you're hardly taking the biggest loss in the world at 220 points worth invested. In a good matchup though, with a strong player using them really quite well, I feel like they're going to be absolutely nightmarish. Just able to ping on and off the board each turn, destroying something important, and maybe switching up their strategy towards the end of the game to help contribute to objectives and maybe take some damage if needed. Unless Games Workshop adds some sort of errata to the rule in the Chaos Space Marine Codex FAQ when it comes out, I feel like we'll see a lot of lists with 10 of these here. Otherwise, perhaps for the other more clearly standout unit, the standard Chaos Space Marine Legionaries I think are really hard to beat for value out of the Codex currently. They're 80 points for 5 of them, and are just fairly spectacularly efficient frontline troops with both good defense, damage and objective control. 5 Marine bodies for 80 points I really don't think is the worst value in the world. Maybe not standout tough, but certainly not terrible. They have good objective control, so if they're on a point, they're probably taking it, and they're just far more dangerous than most enemy battle line troops you might encounter. You could have a las cannon plasma pistol and some bolt pistols at range, and then charge into melee with a whole bunch of chainswords, plus 2 heavy melee weapons for a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2. Dark packs can make them stronger, both in the shooting phase and in the fight phase, to get some sustained or lethal hits as needed, and they can do so quite happily with their icon to reroll the failed results. And then on top of that, they get their inbuilt reroll wound rolls. They get to reroll wound rolls of 1 just permanently, and this goes up to 4 wound rerolls against things on objectives. They've got really quite a nice way of getting them there with rhinos, which are nice and cheap and efficient. They can escort a Chaos Lord into battle if they want an extra bit of punch to really hit the enemy hard with his bunch of damage 3 attacks. And as the standard battle line of Chaos, most attachments have something really quite nice for them. Renegade Raiders, making them very dangerous with extra AP on objectives. They could get Slanesh marked in the pack band to get sustained hits and advance and charge. Deceptors can have them infiltrating to put some genuinely quite scary troops in the midboard to give you a leg up on fighting over those objectives right from the word go. There's plenty for them in veterans, and they get the -1 to wound debuff in Fellhammer, making them abnormally tough. Overall, it seems hard to go too far wrong with a couple of units of these in a Rhino moving towards the midboard, maybe a couple of copies of such. Next up, and maybe a little bit more detachment dependent, is the Chaos Lord. He's 90 points for his free stratagems that you can use for things like command point rerolls, though are more helpful if you've got good battle tactics stratagems in the detachment in question, whether it's reroll undivided wound rolls in the Pact Band Zealots, or using the Armour of Contempt equivalents for the detachments that get one of those. Perhaps just as important, if not more important than that though, is just the sheer amount of melee rage that he can unleash. With a standard guy with a demon hammer, he can get a turn of +1 attacks, +1 strength, and +1 damage to really go to the next level with a whole bunch of strength 9 damage 3 attacks. And with a squad of legionaries or chosen to back him up, he can be an enormous threat to most units in the game. He could certainly profit from the innate reroll wound rolls buff from legionaries as well, getting that against enemies on objectives. It's definitely going to be better in detachments that have good battle tactics stratagems for him though, so maybe not quite as universal as some. Though I still think he's overall really quite solid, particularly as he got the 5-point decrease in the last points update, which was rather nice given that he was pretty competitive before. Finally, I don't know if this one might be considered as a slightly more out there choice, particularly with all the elite damage dealers to consider, but I feel like Chaos Bikers are also a very hard unit to go too far wrong with at the moment, just being a very nice combo of generally fast, tough, and pretty good damage amped up by Dark Packs. Really nice fast moving skirmishers to zoom around doing secondary objectives and things, contesting primaries or bullying lighter units as needed. They've got a 12-inch move, and for 70.6 OC is kind of fine, not quite as good as battle line things, but better than most other things. Within a squad of 3 of them, you can have 2 melter guns at range and also blaze away with 3 combi bolters as well. Their shooting is at least fairly fierce up close, and then they charge into close combat with a bunch of chainsword attacks, a power fist on the sergeant, and a +1 strength boost on the charge, so the chainswords get to hit at strength 5 and the power fist strength 9. Again, like the legionaries, adding dark packs on top of that means that the damage output is genuinely pretty nasty both at range and in melee, and they get to reroll those dark packs with an icon. Again, seem great in Renegade Raiders. They have access to advance and shoot, and advance and charge. Even just the auto advance 6 inches is really quite threatening though. You could zoom to an unlikely location, still be able to fire at full effect, maybe even throw a grenade for some more surprise damage if you're feeling a little bit spendy, and potentially get buffed AP with those combi bolters against anything on objectives. Overall though, I feel like they're just strong enough to justify themselves as your sort of fast moving objective grabbers and trading type units, pretty much regardless of detachment. Probably the biggest downside to them is they're still languishing with their absolutely ancient models. At some point they're definitely going to upgrade them to something similar to Primaris Outrider scale, and I suspect they're going to look pretty good, but the wait might be a fair bit yet. In any case though, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing your takes on which Chaos Space Marine units are strong or not in 10th edition 40k. I'm certainly going to be interested to take a look at some tournament lists that do well, seeing which units are bringing home the victories for the Dark Gods. Let me know if you think anything should be rated a bit higher or a bit lower than I've put it here. I look forward to hearing any reason takes as to why. Certainly keen to learn things from Chaos Generals and your experiences. I think it's a particularly interesting codex to look at, with a fair few very different ways of building strong lists, and lots of units that look at least interesting, but maybe not so many things that are just enormously crazily stand out and dominant. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.